You're listening to the Eleanor stories. I'm Eleanor, and today I have something important to share with you. Take a deep breath, and let's step into this story together. When Margaret Hale arrived at the gates of Whitmore Estate, she did not expect anything good. She did not have that spark in her eyes with which they greet real professionals, nor that expensive coat that screams, "I'm one of you." She came for the job because she needed it like air. The last 2 years had been in some kind of black and white mode. A divorce, a sold ring, a move from a house that smelled of pies and their family laughter to a rented apartment that now smelled only of laundry detergent and the dampness of the stairwell. Her son was long grown, living in another country, calls only on holidays. When she saw the words, caregiver, live-in position, decent salary, in the ad, she felt not greed but relief. It meant she could still keep herself on her feet. The door was opened by a woman in a perfectly tailored suit, as if even at home she were at a board meeting. Her gaze quickly assessed Margaret from head to her neat, unbranded bag. "You are Margaret?" "Yes, ma'am." "I am Victoria Whitmore. Let me clarify the rules at once. Father does not need conversations about the past, sympathy, or life stories. He needs routine, silence, medication, and care. No improvisation, no questions about business. You do only what I say." Margaret nodded as if they were not speaking about her, but about a train schedule. She had long ago learned that one works for the wealthy, not for respect, but for order and practicality. Inside, from afar, it smelled of expensive wood, yet it did not feel any warmer. The house clearly did not smell of children's laughter. There were no blankets forgotten on the steps, no photographs on the mantel. An expensive emptiness in which every step sounded too loud. The man in the armchair by the window looked at her as if he were not a patient, but someone used to seeing people through. His face was slightly twisted, his right hand lying uselessly, yet his natural dignity had not vanished, like an old breed that illness cannot erase. "This is Richard Whitmore," said Victoria, as if presenting an exhibit. "This is Margaret Hale, the caregiver." Richard blinked, long and heavy, as though confirming that he had heard everything. Margaret stepped closer, leaned so he could see her face, and quietly said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. I will be nearby. If you need help, you can simply look at me." He did not smile, but his gaze softened slightly, or perhaps it only seemed so. Margaret began performing her duties: medication, exercises, feeding, slow, short walks down the corridor under supervision. Daniel appeared rarely, but always came with tension, as if he were not visiting his father, but fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. He was outwardly polite, but cold inside. "Thank you. We will take it from here. Do not tire him." Margaret heard in it not "thank you," but "you are temporary." Victoria checked the schedule every day, weighed him, asked how much water her father had drunk, how much he had slept, how many times he had stood up. But Margaret saw how Victoria truly kept control over something else, over the house, over the documents, over what was happening behind closed doors. One night, Margaret was carrying Richard a pillow when she heard a whisper in the study. Victoria was speaking on the phone. "We need to finish before the end of the month. While he hasn't declined yet, everything can be closed cleanly. Yes, I understand the risks. Later, he won't understand anything if we arrange it properly." Margaret froze, but did not move. She knew that tone too well, the tone of a person who calls someone else's life risks. In the morning, she saw how Richard was nervous. His left hand kept clutching the blanket, His gaze clung to the window as if he were expecting an enemy. Margaret read the newspaper aloud, and she saw how at the words "Board of Directors," his nostrils trembled slightly. "Do you want to know what is happening with the company?" she asked once when he looked at the news screen. He made an effort. Yes. That yes was like a stone pulled from his throat. That same day, Margaret was tidying the small library on the upper floor. The shelves were tightly packed with books, but the feeling was as if they had not been opened for a long time. She reached for an old volume, and the book seemed to have a life of its own. It fell and opened on the floor. An old photograph slipped out of it, a young Richard, different, with a lively smile, in a simple coat. Beside him, a woman with a light bob haircut, holding his arm. Their eyes, happy. On the back, it was neatly written, 1994, our first office. You promised we would build honestly. Love, Anne. Margaret felt something knock inside her, as if someone had, for the first time in this house, spoken the word love. She knew that Anne had died many years ago, but it was strange. In this house, it was as if she had never existed. No photographs, no flowers, no conversations. Yet next to the photograph, a narrow ribbon had fallen from the book, like a bookmark. On the top shelf, Margaret noticed a dusty box. She had not been searching, had not planned to. She simply saw it standing there, forgotten. And inside her, something involuntarily said, "The answer is there." She touched the lid. Inside were notebooks tied with a thin ribbon and a neat envelope with the inscription, Anne. Margaret tensed. One must not read what is not hers. But if in this house something was being done behind Richard's back, did not the one who cared for him have the right to understand why he was afraid? She opened the first notebook. Today, Richard said he does not want to become like those who trade their conscience. I laughed and answered, "Then promise me that if one day you become blind to people, I will be your sight." The lines were simple, unpretentious, yet they filled her chest with warmth. In further entries, Anne wrote about the company as a shared cause, about the first construction site, about principles. I insisted on the charter. Let our children one day be adults, but no sole decisions. Richard is strong, but greed can be stronger even than blood. Margaret closed her eyes, rereading the last line. Greed can be stronger than blood. She had not yet managed to put the notebook away when a cold voice sounded in the doorway. "You feel quite comfortable in my rooms, don't you?" Victoria stood with her hands on the banister, like a judge. "Nothing of the sort," Margaret answered evenly. "I'm cleaning." Victoria stepped closer, her gaze falling on the books and the notebook. "Don't touch Father's personal belongings. He doesn't like when someone digs into his history." Margaret calmly placed the notebook back into the box. "I'm not taking anything. I'm just dusting and taking care of him." "You are a caregiver," Victoria said sharply. "Remember that word." They parted, but Margaret understood. She had accidentally touched something this house wanted buried. 2 days later, a man with a briefcase and an official smile arrived at the mansion, a notary. Margaret was carrying a tray with water and vitamins when she heard the conversation in the study. Victoria's voice was overly soft. "Dad, it's just a formality. You're tired, you have the right to rest. We'll take everything on ourselves." Daniel added, "It's temporary. It will be better for you." Better, a word often used to disguise taking what belongs to someone else. The notary spread out the papers. Here and here. Signature authorizing full asset management, including corporate governance changes. Margaret stopped in the doorway. Richard's shoulder was trembling, his left hand gripping the armrest as if holding onto it like the edge of life. He stared at the sheets without blinking, then tried to say something. The sounds came out hoarse and unclear. Victoria quickly held out the pen. "Just sign, Dad." Richard jerked his hand as if he were not ready. Margaret entered, set down the water, and quietly said without raising her voice, "Mr. Whitmore, if you are tired, we can postpone. This is not urgent." Victoria burned her with a look. "You were not asked." But Richard suddenly turned his head toward Margaret and gave the slightest nod, like a silent plea. The notary cleared his throat. "Perhaps we must reschedule. We will return later." Victoria turned pale. "No, now, he agrees. He just—" But Richard turned away toward the window. The signing failed. When the door closed behind the notary, Victoria stepped toward Margaret so close that she could smell her perfume. "Listen to me carefully. If you interfere again, you'll be out, not only from this job. I'll make sure not a single care home hires you. Understood?" Margaret held her gaze calmly. "I understood one thing. Your father did not want to sign." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "You understand too much. Sometimes smart women end badly." She left, leaving coldness in the air. Margaret looked at Richard. He sat motionless, but his eyes were alive, full of fear and anger. He tried to say something. She leaned closer. "Safe," he breathed out. "Study 94. Margaret froze. 1994. The year on the photograph. The year Anne wrote about the charter. And in that moment, Margaret understood. This would not be simply caring for a sick man. This would be a battle for his mind, his name, and his final will. Margaret woke before the alarm. The house was quiet, but it was not peaceful silence. It was the kind before a storm. She washed her face with cold water, fixed her hair, and caught herself thinking that for the first time in a long while, she was going to work not just to finish a shift, but as if to defend a man who could not even properly say the word help. Richard was already awake. He sat staring at the window, his left hand slowly moving over the blanket, as if trying to hold on to something invisible. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said softly. He did not answer, but he looked at her in a way that told her he remembered yesterday's conversation, remembered the word safe, remembered that she had heard him. Victoria left for the city closer to noon. Margaret saw her hurriedly checking a folder with documents, speaking on the phone in short phrases, and not even going in to see her father. "I have a meeting. Daniel will come later," she said in the hallway. "Do not let father get tired." And again that "do not let" sounded as if Richard were not a person, but a resource. When Victoria's car disappeared beyond the gates, it became easier to breathe in the house, but not for long. Daniel arrived an hour later. He passed Margaret with a nod the way one nods to staff. No hello, no how is he. Straight to the study, straight to the papers. Margaret stood in the doorway of the living room and heard Daniel opening desk drawers, rustling through folders, exhaling irritably, as if searching for something specific and not finding it. A few minutes later, he came out. "Where is he?" Daniel asked, not hiding the tension. "In the bedroom. We are doing exercises." "Don't do them long. He needs rest." Margaret held a pause. "He doesn't need rest. He needs clarity." Daniel looked at her as if she had said something improper. "You speak too confidently." "I'm just telling the truth." Daniel said nothing, but a warning flickered in his eyes. When he left, Margaret helped Richard move to the armchair and asked again, The study? Richard nodded, this time more clearly. They moved slowly. Every step was a struggle. But it was not a struggle for muscles. It was for the right to remain master of his own life. In the study, Margaret closed the door. She approached the cabinet, the very one behind which the safe was hidden. The code, 1994? She asked. Richard tightened his lips as if trying to pronounce the numbers, but only exhaled. Yes. Margaret entered 1994. The click sounded louder than it should have, as if the house itself did not want the safe opened. Inside lay a thick folder and several envelopes. On one was written in neat handwriting, "For Richard, if you ever feel alone, Anne." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "May I read?" she asked, looking at Richard. He blinked and slightly inclined his head. It was consent. She opened the folder first, the charter, the original, with seals, with Anne's signature beside Richard's. Margaret began reading aloud, slowly, so Richard would understand every word. No actions related to the transfer of control may be carried out under pressure or during limited capacity of the founder. Any powers of attorney granting the right to alter corporate governance require independent confirmation. In the event of attempts of coercion, the founder has the right to immediately appoint a trusted representative, not being a relative. Margaret lifted her eyes. It clearly states here that you can appoint a trusted person outside the family. Richard looked at her intently. He wanted to say something, but his tongue would not obey. She opened Anne's envelope. The letter was short. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer beside you. I know you. You are strong. But sometimes strong men break quietly when there is no one to talk to. If the children rush, if they begin to pressure you, if they force you to sign for your own good, remember, we built this not for their pride. We built it for meaning. And if one day there is someone beside you who looks at you as a person and not as a sum, trust them. Love, Anne." Margaret swallowed. Beside her, Richard closed his eyes, and a tear slowly rolled down his cheek. "She knew," Margaret whispered. Richard gave the faintest nod. In the corridor, the sound of the front door opening echoed. Margaret sharply lifted her head. Victoria. She quickly put the letter back into the envelope, but did not have time to hide the folder with the charter. The study door flew open. Victoria stood in the doorway with keys in her hand. On her face, surprise that quickly turned into cold fury. "What is going on?" Margaret stood up straight between Victoria and the safe. Mr. Whitmore wanted to look at the documents. Victoria stepped closer. Her gaze slid over the charter, over the seals, over Anne's signature. For a second, she froze, and that very second betrayed her. She was afraid of those documents. "Father should not deal with this," Victoria said quietly but firmly. "It is harmful for him." Richard tried to say something. The sound was rough, as if several things at once were blocking him. Illness, air, fear. Victoria bent toward him almost tenderly. "Dad, why? It will be easier if we take everything on ourselves." Margaret saw Richard tense. He turned his head away. It was not a whim. It was no. "He doesn't want to," Margaret said. Victoria straightened abruptly. "You have no right to speak for him." "Then give him the right to speak for himself," Margaret answered calmly. Victoria narrowed her eyes. "You forget your place." Margaret felt anger rising inside, but did not let it show. "My place is beside a man who cannot defend himself right now." Victoria gave a cold smile. "He is not helpless. He is simply ill, and we are his family. Margaret looked at her. Family does not threaten. Victoria stepped closer, so close that Margaret felt her perfume. Do you want a war? Margaret answered quietly. I want him not to sign what he does not understand. Victoria abruptly turned to the safe and tried to close it. Richard jerked his left, living hand and gripped the edge of the folder. It was a weak movement, but enough to show he understood everything. Victoria froze, and suddenly her voice changed, not daughterly, but businesslike. Fine. If that's the case, tomorrow a commission will come, and everything will be decided officially. What commission? Margaret asked. Medical, psychiatric. We will establish whether he is capable of making decisions, and then no one will listen to a caregiver. She said caregiver with such contempt, it sounded like an insult. Victoria left, slamming the door. Margaret turned to Richard. They want to declare you incompetent. Richard looked at her for a long time, then slowly, very slowly, nodded. And in his gaze was a most frightening thing. He had already expected this. That night, Margaret returned to Anne's diaries, now not out of curiosity, but as to a map. She found an entry. Victoria has always wanted control. Daniel, recognition. I love them, but love does not erase character. If one day I leave, I fear they will forget that their father is a person, not an instrument. That is why the charter. That is why the commission. That is why a third party. The next day, the doctors arrived. With them, Victoria's lawyer. We are here to assess Mr. Whitmore's condition, said the senior physician. Victoria smiled too calmly. Father confuses dates, forgets who he is. It is dangerous for him. He may sign anything. Margaret stood nearby. Richard sat in the chair, clenching his left hand into a fist. The doctors asked questions. Richard answered slowly. Sometimes he made mistakes. On some questions, Victoria even slightly raised her brows, as if to say, "You see?" Then the doctor asked, "Do you understand why we are here?" Richard was silent. Victoria intervened. "He does not understand." And then Margaret leaned toward Richard and quietly said, "Remember 1994. The first office. Anne. The charter. The safe. You promised her." Richard suddenly lifted his eyes and seemed to gather himself into a single point. "I understand," he said. "They want to take." The room fell silent. Victoria went pale. "Dad." "Charter," Richard continued. "Commission cannot, without, independent." Margaret handed the folder to the doctors. They began to read. Victoria's lawyer tried to object. "This charter is outdated." But the physician calmly replied, "A document with signatures and seals does not expire until it is officially revoked." For the first time, Victoria lost her composure. "This is all because of her," she snapped, pointing at Margaret. "She is manipulating him." Margaret did not raise her voice. "I am not manipulating. I am reminding. There is a difference." The senior physician raised his hand. "We cannot issue a decision today. Further evaluation is required. And temporarily, we recommend limiting pressure on the patient." Victoria pressed her lips until they turned white. The commission left. When the door closed, Daniel, who had been silent all this time, sharply turned to Margaret. "Do you understand what you've done?" "I helped him say no. You destroyed the family." Margaret looked at him calmly. "Families are not destroyed by no. Families are destroyed by greed. Daniel wanted to say something but remained silent, and Richard looked at Margaret, and for the first time in his gaze there was not only anxiety, but trust. And it was precisely that trust that made Victoria more dangerous, because now she understood. She had little time left. After the arrival of the independent representatives, Victoria changed. She stopped arguing and applying open pressure. A dangerous silence settled over the house. Margaret felt it. This was the calm before a strike. Richard grew more anxious, slept worse, often woke in the middle of the night, his left hand convulsively gripping the edge of the sheet as if holding onto something invisible. A few days later, the police arrived at the house. Margaret understood everything even before the doorbell rang. From the expression on Victoria's face, there was neither fear nor pain in her eyes. There was cold determination. "We have received a report of stolen jewelry and cash from the safe," the officer said. Richard turned sharply pale. "Anne," he whispered. Victoria lowered her eyes quietly. "I didn't want to believe it, but Mother's earrings are gone, and the money as well. Only the family and the staff knew the safe code." Margaret did not flinch. "You knew the code too." "Of course. I'm his daughter," Victoria answered calmly. The search was quick. In the drawer of Margaret's dresser, they found Anne's earrings and an envelope with cash. Daniel turned away. "That isn't mine," Margaret said evenly. Richard tried to stand. No. Victoria gently touched his shoulder. "Dad, don't worry. We'll figure it out." But there was no sympathy in her voice. There was control. The police took the jewelry for examination. The case was under review. But Victoria had achieved the main thing: doubt. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She knew this was a setup. She remembered the surveillance system Richard had installed many years ago. The archive had been preserved. She opened the recording from the night before the theft. On the screen, it was visible. Victoria enters her room. A few minutes later, she exits. Then the housekeeper enters with a small box and leaves. Margaret watched the recording several times. The fear disappeared. Only cold clarity remained. In the morning, the foundation's lawyer and an auditor came to the house again. When the footage was played in front of Victoria, she went pale. "This is taken out of context," she said sharply. "The context is obvious," the lawyer replied calmly. "Planting evidence." Daniel stepped back. "Vic, is it true?" "You wanted control too," she answered coldly. "Don't pretend you're better." Richard watched the screen in silence, and in his gaze there was something that had not been there before: final understanding. "You are my daughter," he said quietly. Victoria straightened. "I was protecting the company." "No," his voice grew firmer. "You were protecting power." Richard insisted on personally attending the board meeting. He entered the hall with a cane, but on his own. Victoria spoke quickly. "He is under influence. They are using him." Richard raised his hand. "It's easier to sign. Harder to say no." He looked at her. "You were afraid, not for the company. You were afraid that I am still alive." The lawyer presented the financial documents: an offshore structure, preparation for asset withdrawal, a draft power of attorney in case of incapacity. Daniel sat pale. "I thought it was temporary." "Silence is also a choice," Richard replied. The vote was unanimous. Victoria was removed from management. The materials were transferred to court. In court, the housekeeper testified. The financial audit confirmed the attempted withdrawal of funds. The camera recording became the key evidence of the setup. Victoria spoke about care. The judge replied calmly, "Care does not include planting evidence and financial fraud." The verdict? A suspended sentence, a large fine, a ban on managing corporate assets. Victoria left the courthouse alone. Daniel came to his father that evening. "Dad, I didn't want it to turn out like this." Richard looked at him for a long time. "You wanted comfort, not truth." Daniel lowered his head. A month later, the Anne Foundation opened a new children's wing. Richard spoke in person. "When a person grows old, it is easy to declare them weak. When a person is ill, it is easy to force them into silence. But weakness is not in the body. Weakness is in greed." He paused. "And if not for one woman, whom they called just a caregiver, I would have lost not the company. I would have lost my name." Later, he approached Margaret. "Will you stay?" She shook her head. "I came because you were a person. Now you stand on your own." He nodded. "You restored, not the business. You restored me." Margaret left quietly. Photographs of Anne appeared in Whitmore Estate. The house was no longer cold. Victoria never returned there, and when a journalist asked Richard, "What did you understand?" he answered, "Blood makes us relatives, but only conscience makes us family. And if you stay silent when betrayal happens, you become part of it." The story did not end with reconciliation. The story ended with justice.